It's a tech video. It's a politics video. It's a tech video. Abolish intellectual property. I'm totally serious, and I don't even think that goes far enough. So, you know those Snapdragon Copilot Plus laptops and the Mac M series computers? Those things are better. But better than what? Well, in 1972, there was the Boob CPU from Intel. Sorry, that says 8008 because it's an 8-bit CPU. By the 80s, the 8008s kin ate up the market greatly, and they dominated. Thing is, the newer machines based on the 8008 were 16-bit, but used the same 8-bit machine code from before because it already had market dominance and everyone wanted their programs to keep working. Then we went from 16 to 32 bits and still used the 8-bit machine code. And then it became 64 bits like we have today and still uses the 8-bit machine code from the 1970s, but with a ton of layers of shit piled on. We call this the x86 family. Of course, not a single program from back then would run today for other reasons, but we still use it. Now, this whole time, a bunch of people were calling this what it was. Like this guy you might recognize. Very stupid, and actually complex was the word. But as engineers know, complexity is bad. The hardware had to be complicated just to be fast. That is still the case even with simpler systems like ARM, but in the case of ARM, it much less resembles untangling a pile of spaghetti at 90 miles an hour for that poor CPU running your program and getting hot enough to boil water just so you can browse Discord. But another way, the 8008 derived system, the x86 family, it's very different from what the computer actually does. The newer ones like ARM are closer to what the computer actually does. Now what you will hear is that these simpletons will say that ARM is just for power saving, and that x86 is the more powerful architecture. That's kind of like saying that a car with a lighter frame is just there to save gas. You know it's faster too, dumbass. Like, if you put the same engine in a lighter car, it will be faster. It's not just to save fuel. For some reason, people don't understand this because this is the current de facto reality is that ARM is not as fast. That doesn't mean it's not as fast. So, why not use ARM? Because actually now it is as fast. On laptops at the very least. It is as fast. To be frank, we should have been using this or something like it freaking ages ago. There were people raging in the 80s about just use MIPS and in the 90s about just using PowerPC. Now, the people at Intel have kept the x86 family relevant by pushing it to its limit, causing many serious security problems. I can only guess that we've figured all of them out by now, and maybe not. A historical note is that Intel did not want to give up by the 64-bit era. They created this thing called Itanium, which was even more complicated than x86. While AMD carried the x86 torch into 64 bits, Intel fumbled around with some crazy shit that died quickly, but not without a ton of hype and marketing. They said, this is the future, and all of the smart computer people were groaning because it was absolutely stupid. Itanium was the opposite of x86, way too close to the way the hardware actually operates, meaning that both hardware and software are difficult to implement for anybody other than Intel. My suspicion is that Intel was guarding their monopoly by pushing this technology. So again, why can't we just go the simple route? Why doesn't a competitor just come along? Well, the thing is that these days we mostly write software as code, which can, in theory, run on any modern machine with some amount of changes. So why do we keep using x86 since we could just take the source text of the program and compile it for another CPU? As if. See, almost nobody gives you their source. In fact, legally you can't have it most of the time. The best and sometimes only way to know what a piece of software is doing on your machine is to have this source code. Like, for example, when you run Windows, it could be doing literally fucking anything because only Microsoft has the source code. Source code is also the best and sometimes only way to make changes to the software, such as running it on a superior ARM CPU. But understand that if Company A releases their source code, then Company B can see it, and Company B then has less work to do in order to catch up with the software technology of Company A. There's no dilemma here. The move is always to hide your code from competitors. The guy who doesn't hide his code is the loser, with a few exceptions in the case where the people paying for it want to have the code, but generally these people are nerds. Most people are not nerds. Of course, right on time, here come the alleged communists, who are actually radical liberals, such as Richard Stallman, who push software licenses that force you to release your code if it is based on my code. This is a funny consequence of contract law bringing about its own opposite, as all one-sided systems based on fixed axioms tend to do. Some skilled software people have put Stallman's license on their code and legally forced a few big companies to release some source code. But because most people are not radical liberals and most are not nerds, this is an exception and we can probably ignore it. What then is my point if there's nothing we can really do under capitalism for free software? Well, my point is that there's nothing we can do under capitalism for free software. One of the planks of the American Communist Party is the abolition of intellectual property. The horror. See, instead of Company A implementing their tech and then Company B doing the same work with different people and then Company C and D and E and F doing it to the point where the vast majority of code that exists is redundant, which is true, why don't we just share our source code? In fact, why don't we make it illegal not to? That's not part of the ACP program, but it is my own opinion. Now, I have been watching people bitch and whine about AI reading everyone's code. Secret or not, it mishmash, copy-pastes it for anyone who pays. And I say, fuck it, this is a good thing. The AI is actually already doing the job of the communist. Because communism seeks to overcome the limitations that capitalism places on technology, not to impose further limitations, as in the case of many self-described socialists or labor activists who either reject or mischaracterize Karl Marx. What we need in the AI era is not to lock off everything so that the old liberal property model can continue unimpeded. Artists who clutch their brushes over this are part of a reactionary contingent who can and will fuck off. What is actually needed is a gigantic open repository of information so that AI can be used as a public good. We use technology to reduce working hours, and then there's no need for artists to even live off of their work. They can work 10 or 20 hours a week on something actually useful for society and spend the rest of their time how they want to, making art or whatever else. The small minority of artists who can compete with AI are, of course, fully entitled to do so. Of course, I forgot for a moment that I was talking about ARM. Funny enough, China's Long Soon is developing their own architecture called Long Arch, which is probably superior to ARM and x86 because its main architecture is simple and efficient like ARM, but it also has the ability to read x86 instructions without going through a slow translation layer. In practice, it's not as good as x86 or ARM yet, but it probably will be. And if this isn't a perfect analogy for the Chinese model, then I don't know what is. We have communism, we have capitalism, and we have Chinese communism. We have ARM, we have x86, and we have Long Arch. Now, meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, they built a computer based on 3s rather than 2s, and I thought that it was a much more elegant idea than what we do today. Of course, it never took off, but what if they were right? I think maybe we'll know that someday. But until now, at the very least, I run Linux on my ARM laptop, and it's not so bad because Linux is buying for nerds who do release their source code, generally. The experience is still kind of bad. It reminds me of a polycule because there are too many choices to make and none of them are particularly attractive. But compared to the outright cuckoldry that is Windows, I'll take it any day.